Hi, this is Chris. I wanted to talk about whether some activities under the Capitol Dome are deal making or vote trading. So, we often read about the wheeling and dealing among elected officials that occurs in state capitals across the country, even here in California. And while some Capitol observers refer to it as deal making or negotiating, unlawful activities. Others complain that it's involving vote trading and improper activities. Should there be any distinction between the two? So I want to pose that question, which one is it? So the key issue here is whether there's anything improper or unlawful about a legislator agreeing to vote for one bill because of promises that are made to that legislator or to another or by another legislator or even a promise to the governor. There's definitely a give and take process, and compromise is inherent in the lawmaking or legislative process. Is there some point where it might become improper among elected officials? Now, obviously, we know that openly trading votes is a crime for both state and local officials pursuant to the California Penal Code. Vote trading for state elected officials has been a crime for a long time, as have other improper influences on the legislative process. The California Penal Code prohibits vote trading, and that particular provision has been extended to include local officials as well. Now, historically, the courts have been reluctant to examine the internal debates and activities of the legislative branch of state government. The California legislature, under Article 4 of the California Constitution, is granted what we call plenary authority to make laws and engage in the lawmaking process. Now, if there's a claim of improper or possibly illegal activity, are the courts going to examine those allegations by a co-equal branch of government? Some Capitol observers note that if elected officials are precluded from negotiating over provisions of bills or the contents of bills, what might the legislative process turn into ultimately? Will it get bogged down in gridlock because there is no compromise or give and take? While others have raised concern whether it should be impermissible for legislators to secure tangible benefits for their district or their constituents. This is the so-called pork barrel politics that sometimes appears unseemly to some people and often portrayed poorly in the media. But is it actually illegal? Every year in the California legislature, as with the 49 state capitals, and of course, with the US Congress at the federal level, there are deals between lawmakers and the governor. And with the passage of these bills through legislation that's voted on by state assembly members, state senators, sometimes there's private debate, sometimes there's public debate in order to craft these deals. So let's try to examine some of the laws that might help us address this question. First of all, there's an area of California law called crimes against the legislative power. And these provisions are found in Article 3, sections 9050 to 9056 of the California Government Code. And they're intended to combat crimes against the legislature as well as the legislative process itself. So, for example, section 9050 prohibits persons who willfully prevent the legislature and its members from meeting or organizing. It's a felony if you're convicted. Section 9051 provides that people who willfully disturb the legislature or either house while they're in session, or who commits disorderly conduct in the presence of either house is guilty of a misdemeanor. Section 9051.5 provides that bill or resolution includes a constitutional amendment for purposes of the crimes against the legislative power. Section 9052 prohibits fraudulently altering bills or resolutions or constitutional amendments. Section 9053 prohibits fraudulently altering enrolled copies of bills or resolutions after they've been passed by the legislature and approved by the governor. Section 9053.5 deals with publishing any writings that purports to be a bill or resolution when it's not. Section 9054 prohibits people from obtaining anything of value in an effort to improperly influence any member of the legislature. Section 9055 provides that members of the legislature convicted of these types of crimes have to forfeit their office and are disqualified from holding office in California. Section 9056 prohibits persons from using influence for introducing bills and then thereafter having somebody pay them to try to prevent the adoption of that measure. Now, we also have a number of federal and state laws, but they really don't apply to vote trading or negotiating. For example, at the federal level, there's the Hobbs Act, which prohibits actual or attempted extortion or anything affecting foreign commerce. The Hobbs Act was basically enacted to combat racketeering in labor management type disputes. And it's often utilized to address cases involving public corruption or commercial disputes, that sort of thing. The Honest Services Fraud Act is a federal criminal statute dealing with mail and wire fraud. And here it's been used by federal prosecutors in cases of public corruption or where people breach their fiduciary duty to each other. In terms of the California Constitution, it provides that a person who seeks to influence the vote or action of a member of the legislature in that member's legislative capacity by using bribery, promise of reward, intimidation, or other dishonest means is guilty of a felony. Now, this section uses person and member of the legislature, so it appears that it's directed at those who are not members of the legislature and who try to influence a legislator to act in his or her official capacity. Now, the California Constitution also contains the following: the privilege of free suffrage shall be supported by laws regulating elections and prohibiting, under adequate penalties, all undue influence from power, bribery, tumult, or other improper practice. Of course, this raises some questions like what constitutes undue influence, and do legislative negotiations amount to power or bribery or other improper practices? Now, in terms of the California statutes, bribery is a logical place to address the query we posed about vote trading versus negotiating in the legislative process. Bribery is generally defined as an effort to influence a public official in conducting their official work using money or gifts. But in legislative negotiations, neither money nor gifts change hands among legislators or among legislators and the governor's office. So let's look at some specific California Penal Code sections that deal with public officers, public employees, and legislative officers. Here they talk about in California's Penal Code the definition of bribery, which is to signify anything of value or advantage, present or prospective, or any promise or undertaking to give, ask, or accept with a corrupt intent to influence unlawfully the person to whom it was given, or in his or her official actions or a vote of, again, any public or official capacity this person is engaged in. Now, the law doesn't require that the bribe be made or received to constitute a crime. However, could legislative negotiations amount to bribery? Have legislators been given something of value by each other or by the governor? In other words, did the governor or perhaps legislative leadership promise something with a corrupt intent to influence other legislators when they're going to cast a vote on a bill, such as the state budget or a controversial legislative measure? I mean, these are pretty high thresholds to meet, and I don't think are really applicable to legislative negotiations. Now, there's a section of state law related to bribing a legislator, but it seems unlikely that providing funding for, say, a specific project in a legislator's district in the state budget, for example, could constitute a bribe. Do legislative leaders or the governor act with a corrupt intent when they're negotiating over provisions of the state budget or other public policy issues that are contained in a bill? You know, bribery is premised upon the elected official receiving some personal financial benefit. And I don't think anyone argues that this occurs when legislators deliberate on bills and negotiate or over the state budget. Now, this section of state law has actually been interpreted to prohibit vote trading. And that's because the state's criminal laws not only outlaw bribery, but also any attempt to menace, deceit, suppress truth, or use any corrupt means to influence a member of the legislature in giving or withholding his or her vote. So this statutory language would appear to be a broad prohibition and could be applicable to legislative negotiations. In addition, the use of threats or force to compel a public officer to perform an official act could also be prosecuted under California's Penal Code pursuant to the state's extortion law. This section of the Penal Code provides that extortion is the obtaining of property from another with his consent or the obtaining of an official act of a public officer induced by a wrongful use of force or fear or under color of official right. Now, of course, voting is an official act by a legislator. But again, I pose, are legislative negotiations permissible even if they result in a vote by means of fear or under color of an official's right? Well, in a similar vein, the California Penal Code deals with bribes by legislators and makes it a felony for a legislator to ask, receive, or agree to receive anything of value with a corrupt intent to influence the legislator's vote on an official matter. Penal Code Section 86 also prohibits a legislator from conditioning his or her vote on that of another legislator's vote. And that is one definition of vote trading. Here again, it appears that the California Penal Code deals with bribes and the receipt of personal financial benefit from the legislator. in their official conduct. Would the result of legislative negotiations amount to bribery under state law? The interesting provision under this Penal Code Section 86 is the clause that prohibits a legislator from conditioning his or her vote on that of another legislator. This implies vote trading with another legislator is prohibited. In other words, if you vote for my bill, then I'll vote for your bill. However, is this what actually occurs in a legislative negotiation? In other words, does a legislative negotiation amount to an explicit quid pro quo, say in budget negotiations, for example? It seems to me that that's an unlikely case in the California state capitol. Now, this overall question leads to an interesting U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit decision that I think sheds some insight into how to address the fundamental question that we've posed about vote trading versus proper negotiating over bills. The case was Porter versus Bowen, and it's a federal appeals court decision for the Ninth Circuit that covers California and a number of Western states. And it dealt with the First Amendment and basically barring the state of California from closing the 2000 Nader Gore vote trading websites. So the federal appellate court said that the exchange of political rather than personal benefits rendered an activity protected by the US Constitution's First Amendment, even if the vote exchanges were somehow enforceable. Now, to be fair, this opinion of the Federal Court of Appeals dealt with individual voters rather than elected officials, so the standard may be different. Nonetheless, this part of the court's opinion provides, I think, a sound basis for finding the answer to our fundamental question is no, that legislative negotiations don't amount to vote trading. So whatever the wisdom is of using vote swapping agreements to communicate positions, these types of agreements differ from the conventional and obviously illegal vote buying, which conveys that no other message than that the parties were willing to exchange votes for money for some other form of private profit. And the Supreme Court also held in Brown versus Hartledge in 1982 that vote buying may be banned without trenching on any right of association that's protected by the First Amendment. Now, vote swapping is more akin to the candidate's pledge in the Brown case, in which they took a pay cut if they were to be elected. And the court concluded that that was constitutionally protected. And that's different than the unprotected vote buying. Like the candidate's pledge, vote swapping involves a promise to confer some ultimate benefit on the voter or the citizen, that is a member of the general public. It's another person's agreement to vote for a particular candidate. Now, unlike vote buying, vote swapping is not an illegal exchange for private profit. Remember, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit created a distinction between an exchange for political profit, but prohibited or made it illegal for private profit. With vote swapping, the only benefit a vote swapper can receive is a marginally higher probability that his or her favored or preferred electoral outcome will happen. In another case, in a law review article on calling it First Amendment values in high-tech political coalitions. The author said, there can be no serious assertion that anyone entered into a vote swap arrangement for private profit or any other form of enrichment. So without money changing hands, which is the traditional definition of bribery, it appears the First Amendment would protect legislative negotiations. And that's because I think that these legislative deals over the budget or over legislation amount to providing political benefits. And it's actually being bestowed like on constituents of the elected official and would have to be protected by the First Amendment. Now, that's distinguished these political benefits from personal benefits, because again, the political benefits, they only accrue to the legislator indirectly. Whereas personal benefits, of course, accrue to the legislator himself or herself. So in the end, I think these legislators are looking out for what's best for their legislative district, their constituents, and because the elected officials don't receive any personal financial benefit from their votes, I think it's entirely proper. And again, we recognize that compromise and give and take is a part of the legislative process in a functioning democracy. And in fact, elected officials have to be in a position to cooperate with one another to ensure that there isn't gridlock in the process and that government is run properly.